In the misty mountains of Transylvania, where medieval castles pierce the fog and ancient forests whisper forgotten secrets, one name has haunted humanity for over a century: Dracula. But who or what is Dracula, really? Is he merely a fictional vampire born from the imagination of an Irish novelist, or does his legend reach deeper into the blood-soaked soil of history itself? I'm your host, and welcome to this exploration of one of Gothic horror's most enduring figures. If you're fascinated by the dark corners where history meets mythology, please subscribe and follow. Your support helps continue uncovering these incredible stories. Tonight, we're peeling back the layers of cape and coffin to reveal the complex truth behind Dracula, a figure who exists simultaneously as a 15th century warlord, a literary sensation, and an immortal archetype of terror. In 1897, a relatively unknown Irish theater manager named Bram Stoker published a novel that would forever change the landscape of horror literature. Dracula emerged not as a spontaneous creation, but as the culmination of years of research, folklore collection, and literary refinement. Stoker spent 7 years researching European folklore, vampiric legends, and the historical figure who would lend his name to fiction's most famous vampire. The historical figure behind the legend of Dracula was Vlad III, Prince of Wallachia, who ruled during the 15th century. He bore the name Dracula, meaning son of the dragon, or more ominously, son of the devil, a title inherited from his father's membership in the Order of the Dragon. History remembers him best as Vlad the Impaler, a ruler whose name became synonymous with ruthless and terrifying punishment. Yet Bram Stoker's connection to this real-life prince was surprisingly thin. He drew little more than the name itself and the shadowed landscape of Transylvania. It was not until 1890 that Stoker encountered the Wallachian ruler Dracula, mentioned briefly in a footnote of the historical volume, an account of the principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia by William Wilkinson. That single reference was enough. Until then, Stoker's vampire had carried a far less striking name: Count Vampire. But the moment he encountered Dracula, he recognized its power and its horror. This realization is still preserved in his research notes, now housed at the Rosenbach Museum and Library in Philadelphia, where the name Vampire is crossed out and replaced with unmistakable finality by Dracula. But the most crucial influence on Dracula came from an 1872 novella that predated Bram Stoker's masterpiece by 25 years. Carmilla, written by Irish author Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, introduced innovations that Stoker would later perfect. Le Fanu's vampire was Carmilla Karnstein, a female vampire who preyed primarily on young women, introducing themes of forbidden desire and psychological seduction. In Carmilla, Le Fanu established the vampire's ability to transform into animals. As stated in the text, sometimes it has been a beautiful young lady, sometimes it has resembled a beast. The novella also depicted the vampire as capable of walking in daylight, weakened but not destroyed by the sun, a detail often forgotten in later vampire lore. Most significantly, Carmilla could only be destroyed by specific rituals: decapitation, a stake through the heart, and burning of the body. Stoker absorbed all of these elements. Like Carmilla, Dracula would shapeshift and entrance his victims. Like Carmilla, he would require the same destruction ritual. Even the structure of Le Fanu's story, told through letters and diary entries, would be mirrored in Stoker's epistolary novel. Carmilla was the crucible in which modern vampire literature was forged, and Dracula was its finest product. Stoker's novel tells its tale through a collection of journal entries, letters, newspaper clippings, and phonograph recordings, an epistolary structure that creates an illusion of documentary authenticity. This technique wasn't merely stylistic. It served to ground the supernatural horror in a framework of modern, rational documentation. The story begins with Jonathan Harker, a young English solicitor, traveling to Castle Dracula in Transylvania to assist the Count with a real estate transaction in London. What makes Dracula so terrifying isn't just his supernatural abilities, but how Stoker carefully constructed him as a predator who exploits the vulnerabilities of Victorian society. The Count possesses superhuman strength, the ability to transform into a bat, wolf, or mist, control over the weather and certain animals, and most significantly, immortality sustained by human blood. Yet he's also bound by specific limitations. He cannot enter a dwelling uninvited. He's repelled by garlic and crucifixes. He casts no reflection in mirrors, and he must rest in his native Transylvanian soil. These restrictions aren't arbitrary. They reflect deep-rooted folklore from Eastern Europe, where vampire legends had circulated for centuries. In Romanian and Slavic traditions, vampires were often believed to be unable to cross running water of their own accord, a detail Stoker incorporated when Dracula must be transported across the English Channel in his coffin-filled boxes of earth. The novel's setting moves from the remote, medieval Castle Dracula to the modern metropolis of London, creating a powerful contrast. Dracula represents an ancient aristocratic evil infiltrating the heart of the British Empire at its zenith. He purchases property at Carfax, an estate in Purfleet, Essex, positioning himself to prey upon London's millions. But how did Stoker's Dracula become a vampire? Unlike modern vampire fiction, the 1897 novel provides only hints, requiring us to piece together his origin from fragments scattered through the text. In Chapter 3, Dracula reveals elements of his history to Jonathan Harker. It is written in the book as, "Who was it but one of my own race who as voivod crossed the Danube and beat the Turk on his own ground? This was a Dracula indeed. Woe was it that his own unworthy brother, when he had fallen, sold his people to the Turk and brought the shame of slavery on them." This passage connects the fictional Count directly to the historical Vlad. The novel suggests that Dracula's transformation into a vampire resulted from his warrior past and possible dealings with dark forces. Van Helsing, the vampire hunter, explains this in Chapter 18 as, "The Draculas were, says Arminius, a great and noble race, though now and again were scions who were held by their coevals to have had dealings with the evil one." This implies that the Count or his ancestors made some pact with demonic powers, trading their mortality for eternal existence. The novel meticulously catalogs the vampire's limitations, creating a creature of immense power but crucial vulnerabilities. Dracula possesses extraordinary physical strength. He can climb castle walls face downward like a lizard, as Harker witnesses in horror. The Count commands the weather, summoning storms and fog. He controls meaner things, as Van Helsing notes: the rat and the owl and the bat, the moth and the fox and the wolf. Dracula can shapeshift, taking the forms of these creatures and even transforming into mist, what the novel calls elemental dust. According to Van Helsing's exposition in Chapter 18, he can, within limitations, appear at will when and where and in any of the forms that are to him. Yet these powers come with rigid constraints. The Count cannot enter a dwelling unless invited, a limitation rooted in ancient folklore about threshold magic. Once invited, however, he can return at will. He cannot cross running water except at the slack or flood of the tide. Garlic repels him, as do sacred objects from Christian tradition. A crucifix can hold him at bay, and sacred Eucharist wafers burn his flesh like acid. Most crucially, Dracula is bound to his native soil. Throughout the novel, he transports 50 boxes of Transylvanian earth to England, requiring this connection to his homeland to restore his strength. This detail draws from the folkloric belief that vampires must rest in the soil of their graves. Sunlight limits but does not destroy Stoker's Dracula, another detail borrowed from Carmilla. As Van Helsing explains, during daylight hours, the Count loses his supernatural powers and can only assume his human form, but he doesn't burn or disintegrate. This is contrary to most film adaptations, but consistent with the novel's text. The vampire's method of creating others of his kind follows a specific ritual. The victim must be repeatedly fed upon until weakened, then forced to drink the vampire's own blood. Mina Harker undergoes this horrifying process, described in Chapter 21, when Dracula makes her drink from a self-inflicted wound on his chest, declaring, "And you, their best beloved one, are now to me flesh of my flesh, blood of my blood, kin of my kin." What makes Dracula's powers truly terrifying isn't their scope, but their psychological dimension. Stoker understood that the vampire worked as much through seduction as violence. The novel presents vampirism as a kind of disease or infection. Lucy Westenra's transformation is described with medical precision, as she slowly wastes away despite receiving multiple blood transfusions from her suitors and Van Helsing. The blood transfusions themselves carry suggestions of violated intimacy, each man literally mingling his blood with Lucy's, creating what Van Helsing calls a symbolic polyandry. Dracula's mental powers are perhaps more disturbing than his physical ones. He can hypnotize victims, controlling their minds and actions. He creates a telepathic link with those who have tasted his blood, allowing him to sense their thoughts and locations. Mina, after being contaminated by Dracula's blood, becomes a living compass pointing toward the Count, even across vast distances. The vampire doesn't just take blood, he invades the mind, corrupts the will, and transforms the victim into a version of himself. The transformation into a vampire is presented as a corruption of the soul, not merely the body. When Lucy Westenra becomes a vampire, she retains her beautiful appearance, but becomes inverted. The novel describes her in chapter 16. The sweetness was turned to adamantine, heartless cruelty, and the purity to voluptuous wantonness. She preys upon children, the ultimate violation of her former maternal nature. Destroying a vampire in Stoker's world requires specific rituals that blend Christian tradition with folklore. Van Helsing, drawing on what he claims is ancient knowledge, explains the process. A stake through the heart, decapitation, and stuffing the mouth with garlic. The staking itself is described in brutal detail when performed on Lucy. It must be done by a loved one, and it releases the soul from its cursed state. As her fiancé drives the stake through her heart, Lucy's face transforms from demonic fury to peaceful release. This redemptive element is crucial to Stoker's theology of vampirism. The vampire is both perpetrator and victim, both monster and tragic figure. Destroying the vampire's body releases its imprisoned soul, allowing it to find peace. When Dracula himself is finally destroyed in the novel's climax, Mina observes that in the moment before his body crumbles to dust, a look of peace crosses his face. The warrior finally granted rest after centuries of cursed existence. Castle Dracula itself functions as an extension of its master, ancient, labyrinthine, filled with hidden dangers. Jonathan Harker's initial imprisonment there establishes the castle as a space where normal rules don't apply. He cannot leave, he's served food by invisible hands, and he discovers his host crawling down the castle wall face first like a lizard, an image that crystallizes Dracula's inhumanity. Within the castle, Harker encounters 3 female vampires, often called Dracula's brides, though the novel never explicitly names them as such. These women represent uninhibited female sexuality, approaching Harker with predatory desire. Dracula drives them away, claiming Harker for himself, but promises them a victim, a child in a bag. This scene establishes the vampires' utter inhumanity and their predation on the innocent. The crypt beneath the castle holds boxes of Transylvanian earth where Dracula must rest. This detail, drawn from folklore about vampires needing their grave soil, becomes crucial to the plot. The vampire hunters must find and sterilize these refuges with communion wafers, systematically eliminating Dracula's safe havens and forcing his retreat. The castle itself represents the old world, feudal, Gothic, operating by ancient and terrible laws. London represents the new world, industrial, rational, progressive. Dracula's attempt to establish himself in London becomes an invasion of the new by the old, modernity threatened by ancient barbarism wearing aristocratic clothing. The climax of Stoker's novel inverts the traditional Gothic structure. Rather than the heroes trapped in the vampire's castle, they pursue him back to his homeland, racing against sunset as Dracula flees toward Transylvania in his last remaining box of earth. This journey reverses Jonathan Harker's original trip, but now the English are the invaders, carrying modern weapons and faith into the ancient landscape. The final confrontation occurs not in a castle, but in the open, on a mountain pass, as Romani servants transport Dracula's coffin toward his stronghold. The actual destruction of Dracula in the novel is swift and almost anticlimactic. Jonathan Harker slashes the Count's throat with a kukri knife, while Quincy Morris plunges a Bowie knife into his heart. No stake, no decapitation, just steel blades. Yet the effect is immediate. It is written in the book as, before our very eyes, and almost in the drawing of a breath, the whole body crumbled into dust and passed from our sight. This moment reveals something crucial about Stoker's vampire. For all his power, Dracula remains bound to his physical form. Destroy that form, and the centuries catch up instantly. The ancient warrior returns to the dust he should have become 400 years earlier. Quincy Morris, the American vampire hunter, dies from wounds received in the final battle, making him the hero's only fatality. His death serves as a sacrifice, the price of destroying ancient evil. But more significantly, it demonstrates that while Dracula can be defeated, confronting such primal darkness always exacts a cost. The novel ends not with Gothic horror, but with a note of domestic normalcy. 7 years later, the Harkers have a son, born on the anniversary of Quincy Morris's death, and named after him. The written records of their adventure have faded. Ink exposed to light and air has degraded, making their documented proof unreliable. This brilliant touch suggests that the supernatural, once confronted and defeated, fades from the rational world, leaving only memories and stories that seem increasingly unbelievable even to those who lived them. Stoker's Dracula sold modestly during his lifetime. The author died in 1912 without knowing that his creation would become immortal in ways the Count himself would envy. The novel has never been out of print since its publication, and has spawned countless adaptations, interpretations, and reimaginings. What makes Dracula endure? Perhaps because Stoker created a villain of perfect ambiguity, sophisticated yet savage, seductive yet repulsive, a creature of immense power bound by rigid limitations. Dracula is the ultimate predator and the ultimate outcast, commanding armies of the night while existing in profound isolation. The Count represents something fundamentally human even in his monstrousness: the desire for immortality, the fear of death, the hunger for power, and the loneliness of existence. Thank you for joining me in the shadows today as we explored the true story of Dracula. Not just the character, but the history, influences, and ideas that created the king of vampires. If you found this journey into darkness illuminating, please subscribe and follow for more episodes exploring the myths, monsters, and legends that have shaped human imagination. Until we meet again in the next episode, remember, some stories never die. They simply wait in darkness for the right moment to rise again.